So the first thing to say is I'll just start Ascoilga in Irish. So I would say it's mór an ordomsa an fila éireannach Jane Clarke a choirí láthair dómh go léir agus míle buíochas díobh a sucht fé an seo an tráthnóna áling sin. Now, a free book for anyone who translates that. I just said that, it's a great honor for me to present the Irish poet Jane Clarke as we launch Jane's two new collections in the United States. And I am really, really appreciative of the fact that you have chosen to show up to this evening on such a lovely evening. I know the city's depressed about the Nats, but I'll tell you, that depression is about to be lifted over the next 45 minutes when you listen to Jane and hear Jane's work. So I'm Paddy Mescal, I'm chair of Solas Nua. Our mission in Washington is to bring and present the best of contemporary Irish arts to Washington, D.C. audiences. So given the context of that mission, it is perfect that Jane is with us tonight. And so for us, the pleasure in what we do is not just bringing over artists, but then audiences here in Washington choosing to show up and engage with the artist and engage with the art. And in so doing, we hope we make a contribution to Ireland and to the culture of Washington, D.C. So I really appreciate you coming. Thank you very much. The Irish word for poet is file, F-I-L-E, and it comes from an old Gaulish word from about the 4th century, and it means to see through, to see beyond. So it's an old word, but I think for poets, the meaning is still very relevant today, because I think that's one of the things poetry does for us. It helps us to confront the world as we see it normally and helps us to see beyond, to see through, and to make new meanings and new interpretations and maybe new connections in the world that we see. In Ireland, in ancient Gaelic Ireland, the king or the queen was the highest, and then the next person down was the poet. So we've no more kings or queens in Ireland, some might say thankfully, but anyway, we have no more kings and queens in Ireland, but we do have poets, and we have great poets and wonderful poets like Jane Clarke. The Irish Times critic of poetry, John McAuliffe, I just want to quote a few lines from him, which I think are very relevant. He said that poetry is a slow art. Its practitioners emerge into the light every now and then with polished work, which begins to circulate, slowly finding readers and responses through booksellers, through readings, through workshops, and through interviews. Up and coming original voices are constantly in dialogue and dance with the more experienced voices. Poets and poems have the gift to take the familiar and make it seem strange and wonderful. Poets remind us that our world is not one-dimensional and that we are not one-dimensional. That day-to-day life and day-to-day mundane events are illuminated by memory, by hope, by imagination, and sometimes even by the miraculous. We must keep room in our lives for this expression of wonder and mystery on a day-to-day basis, beyond the immediate, beyond the practical, beyond the pragmatic. A life without magic and mystery is a tough life. The poet Paul Salon once said that a poem is like a message in a bottle, searching to find its ideal reader on some beach where it's washed up. And I think for me, that's one of the things that Jane's poems do. I grew up on a farm the same as Jane, and I grew up by a river the same as Jane. Jane is a poet, I'm not. So when I read Jane's poems, and when I read Jane's poems, she is able to say for me what I am unable to say for myself. The feelings and the emotions and the observations that she makes in her work make my life in Ireland in a small village come alive. Jane grew up in a small farm, not in a small farm, in a decent-sized farm, but in a small village in County Roscommon. And that life that she lived, as you will see, influences a lot of her work. But just like everyone will engage with Jane's work on its own merits and for themselves, because I believe what we each make from poems and poetry and poets is very personal. So I just want to share very quickly 5 things that makes Jane's poems, just for Paddy Mescal, something special. The first thing is Jane's poems are incredibly accessible to me. The language is as spare and bare as a winter's field, and there's no embellishments, and there's no needless kind of bells and whistles on it. It's beautiful, and therefore I can enter into the poem. But even though it's simple and accessible, it still contains room for mystery and exploration for me, and I love that about your work, Jane. The second thing I like about the work is truth. You know, Sam Cooke, the great king of soul, he was once commented that, he was complimented on his voice. He was told, "You have a beautiful voice." And the great Sam said, "Well, thank you for that compliment. But a voice should not be measured by its beauty, but whether it seeks to seek and speak the truth." So for me, Jane's poetry speaks the truth as she sees it. And in that intensity of her truth-seeking and truth-speaking, it gets to universal truths. And truths, I think, and meaning that we can all connect to. In a tough world now, a world with lots of brutality and lots of hostility and lots of pain, Jane's poems for me contain a sensitivity and a compassion and an understanding and a forgiveness of our humanity and of the relationships in our lives and the hurts we've endured and inflicted by others on us. So this sensitivity and compassion and this forgiveness and this gentleness and tenderness, which doesn't mean it's soft poetry. Jane's poetry still confronts the hardness of relationships and the hardness of loss and the hardness of broken relationships, but it does so in a way that ennobles us and lifts us up for me. The fourth thing I love about Jane's work, and I grew up, as I say, in a farm, was its attentiveness to nature and the craft of farming and the activities of farming. When I read some of Jane's poems, I could be back on my farm in Ireland, digging ditches and sowing the potatoes and cutting hay and looking at the thistles, and my dad saying, "That's your job for the day, you better cut them down." And Jane's work does that. Jane's work is almost like going to a botany class or a wildlife class, with its attention to detail and its observation and the connection between all sorts of life in our life. And the last thing I would say that Jane's poetry means to me is that poems is the language and the music of the language and the words in the language. The poems are sculpted. As I said earlier, I think they're bare, stripped down to their edge. But the metaphors and the similes and the words and the rhythm and the rhyme and the similes, they just dance and move along. And so each poem has its own lovely momentum for me. And that's one of the reasons I love reading it. It's clear. The language is clear. It's direct. It's lovely. I hope you enjoy Jane's poems and her readings. She will introduce each poem, read the poem, and then go on to the next one. Jane will read for about half an hour-ish, and then we will have a question and answer session. So please, she told me she hates easy questions. She was a great student, so she loves hard questions. So the more complicated the questions, the better. And then we will go back up above, and we will continue the reception and sell more books and sign. Just want to remind you, the holiday time is coming, lads, right? So now, what's one of the toughest times about the holidays? What gifts do I give to people? The gift of poetry, Irish poetry, Jane Clarke's poetry. You can't find a better gift. So I would say from the flat, rich fields of Roscommon and the hills of County Wicklow, would you give a nice, warm Washington welcome to Jane Clarke?
Thanks so much, Paddy, for that introduction. I was writing a few notes of the things that he was saying about my poetry, because it's always very interesting to hear how your poetry is experienced by others. And just to say, before I begin, to thank NYU for inviting me here this afternoon and giving me this opportunity to be with all of you, to thank all of you for coming along, and to thank Paddy and Darlene for all they're doing, along with everybody else in Solas Nua, to make this trip to the States really exciting, but also very fulfilling for me. And I do think it's a kind of a highlight for my as part of my life as a poet so far, being here with all of you. So I'll start to read some poems. As Paddy said, I grew up in a farm in Roscommon, but I only actually started to write in my early 40s. And 10 years, probably my first poem was when I was 44, and 10 years later my first collection was published. And then 4 years later I had 2 books this year, 2 other books brought out. So I say that in a way to encourage other people as well, that I think it's never too late to give expression to your creativity. But I'm going to start with 2 of the poems that are in the first collection, The River. And the first one, I was asked to talk to a group about the process of writing a poem. And the metaphor that came to mind was building a dry stone wall. And then that led to this poem. Dry stone wall. I'll skim the scraw, dig a trench wide and deep to hold the given stone. Lay silver grey against green, rocks with square planes to build off, slivers thin as slate to level in between. I'll lift the stones, test where they'll nestle into what's already there, fill the middle with spalls, keep the edge stones from falling in. I'll use old stones, dappled with lichen and moss, leave gaps to let the wind blow through, nooks for pennyworth and heart's tongue to grow. I'll cover the joins, mind the batter, stack each course till it takes its place between 2 fields. Keep a few of the finest for the finish, long and flat capstones to span the width. It'll be the kind of wall cattle will stand by, stretching their necks for a scratch on a high stone. Any of you who've been in Ireland will know that the dry stone walls begin once you cross the Shannon when you're going west. And that's always a sense, even though now my home is in Wicklow, when I cross the Shannon, I also have a very strong sense of coming home. So the second poem I'm going to read from this collection is based on that perennial Irish question, who owns the field? But it's a perennial Irish question, but it's a question all over the world. Now, it has been in the past, and it probably will continue to be. And this is in the form of a villanelle, so there's a very strong rhythm and repetition in it that you'll hear. Who owns the field? Is it the one who is named in the deeds, whose hands never touched the clay? Or is it the one who gathers the sheaves, takes a side to the thistles, plants the beech, digs out the dockweed, lays the live hazel? Is it the one who is named in the deeds, or the one who pulls ragwort on his knees, lifts rock into a cart, splits larch for steaks, the one who gathers the sheaves, slashhooks the briars, scatters the seed, cuts his hand on barbed wire, hangs the gate? Is it the one who is named in the deeds, or the one who could surely lead to where children made a hiding place in an old lime tree? He gathers the sheaves. Is it the one who tends cattle and sheep and can tell you how the field got its name? Is it the one who is named in the deeds, or the one who gathers the sheaves? That poem was reviewed in a newspaper in Galway, and the poet reviewer said, this poet is a Marxist, whether she knows it or not. Having studied Marx in philosophy in college many years ago, I knew what he was talking about. So the next group of poems I'd like to read are from both of my first collection and then my more recent one. And it's interesting now having three collections to read from, because I see the poems talking to each other across the books in a way that kind of surprises me. Even when I was getting this ready this morning, I was realizing the connections. And so this group, I'd like to read 4 poems that for me are about the women of the 30s and 40s in Ireland, my mother's generation, those women who bridged the old Ireland and the new Ireland, and who, for many of them, what they wanted, particularly for their daughters, was education, and they wanted their daughters to have independence, and they wanted a different life for their daughters. They didn't quite get it for themselves, but they could see the potential, the possibilities. I mean, these are the women who had to leave work once they got married. They were forced to leave the public service, for example. These are those women. So the first of these is in my first collection, and it's The Suitcase. As a child, I didn't understand that despair was a neighbour of love. And if you were lucky, it stayed beyond the garden gate, just visiting from time to time to borrow sugar, test faith. As a child, I didn't understand that when my mother showed me the nightie, toothbrush, nylons, miniature Bible, and summer dress she kept packed in the suitcase under the bed, it was herself she was telling, I can go if I want to. Sometimes I checked, had she emptied it yet? Sometimes I wanted to shout, go if you're going, why wait? I didn't understand. It was the suitcase that helped her to stay. And then a poem in the voice of my mother, that came from my mother, ringing a phone call with my mother one day. And lots of poems take lots and lots and lots of work, but this one was just given to me. Back of an envelope. I don't know what's come over your father, my mother says on the phone. He left a note on the back of an envelope. Gone herding, won't be long. Where did he think I'd think he was gone? All those years, if I asked where he was going, where he had been, he'd act like I'd tethered him to a post. And then today, he leaves a note. And then a poem from my new collection, but linked to this theme, because, looking back at my mother and I think other mothers of her age, they were feminists, but they wouldn't have called themselves that. They wouldn't have had the language for that. But my mother also wanted me to be a good housewife, should I need those skills. Hers. My mother said she just knew I was going to be a girl. 2 boys before me and 2 boys after, fodder for a hungry farm. But I was hers. She taught me her tricks of the trade. It'll look like dinner is nearly ready if the table is set when he comes in. Bread and butter will fill them up. Add 3 drops of vinegar to water so your mirrors and windows will gleam. Cool your fingers before rubbing lard into flour for pastry. A handful of ground almonds will keep your fruitcake moist. Darn a few socks every night and never leave the ironing for more than a week. Don't cut off rhubarb stalks with a knife, just twist them clean from the crown. And always hold on to the children's allowance. A woman must have something of her own. And then the last poem in this little group of poems that I wanted to read is from the summer of my leaving cert. Some people will know what that is. That's your final exam in secondary school, and it was the final exam that I did before I left home and went to university. Map. She pinned a simplicity pattern on sky blue denim, fed the fabric through the machine, sewing swirl to swirl for the skirt that would take me away from her. Among spools of thread, ribbons, bias binding and zips, she found the pinking shears and cut the fringed hem. A paper pattern's like a map, she said. Arrowheads give direction. Dots mark collars and pockets, where to tuck or pleat. Notches show fittings for waist, hips, and breasts. That was when we believed if I followed the map, I could be whoever I wanted to be. As you probably know, we've gone through lots of social change in Ireland, particularly in the last number of years. We've had 2 really significant referenda that have made a difference in the lives of every family in the country. And the first being on May 22nd, 2015, when marriage equality was passed. And it allowed myself and my partner, who's here tonight, to get married, having been together already 20 years. And when we were getting married, it was this poem really is to mark that making vows those 20 years later, when you already know each other very well, doesn't have quite the innocence or the freshness of when maybe you know each other for 4 years. So that's where this poem came from, vows. I can't promise it's chiseled from gold in spirals that speak of forever. I can't tell you it's wise as a mountain with pines that reach for heaven. I can't promise it's flawless as honey, gathered by bees in bell heather. I can't say it's simple as silk, spun from cocoon into treasure. But I promise it's rooted as rowan, with berries that sing to September. I promise its to and its fro will surprise like Glenmalure weather. A seasoned rowboat, moored or unmoored at your pleasure. And then in my latest collection, I've also marked the other referendum, which was on May 25th, 2018, which allowed for the first time for abortion to be legalised in Ireland. a very important day for the human rights of women in Ireland. What I felt that it marked an increasing compassion in Irish society, and also an increased, I suppose, a kind of a sensitivity to each other, knowing that for some people that is still a very complicated and difficult issue for them, and for most people, for everybody. But I felt that there was a kind of a maturity in the way Irish people said, this is something we need to do for our sisters, our mothers, our daughters. And I wanted to mark that in this poem. Polling Station. In the queue up to the door of the schoolhouse, neighbours welcome sunshine after the wettest of wet winters. Spirits lift at the sight of fields drying out, grass thickening, calves thriving, unstoppable growth. There's talk of young ones speeding home to vote, swallows back to the barn. No one asks anyone where they'll place their ex. Every family has stories, left like ploughs and harrows among thistles behind the sheds. And I just have to say, as many of you may know, that only this past week in Northern Ireland, they got marriage equality and they got the legal right to abortion. And young women, it was just glorious to see it. I was over here, but I saw a video of where all these young women went up from the south to celebrate with their sisters in the north. And I found that very moving. And there is something very exciting happening amongst young people in Ireland, and young women in Ireland are leading the way in terms of that kind of social change. Okay, so I'd like to move on to read a number of poems from this collection. So this came out in April of this year, and a year previously, Mary Evans Picture Library in London contacted me out of the blue to see would I be interested in writing a sequence of poems in response to a family archive of a young man who went to the First World War when he was 20 and died there at the age of 24, just a month before the end of the war. So I had to think long and hard about whether I could do such a thing. I'd never taken on a commission like that before. And also, obviously, there are the political issues about I didn't want to in any way glorify war. And also, it was a British soldier, and I didn't know how I could identify or empathise, with that experience. But then I read the letters and I looked at the photographs, and what I saw was a young man and his sister, a young man and a young woman. And their experience is the universal experience of war. And there was so much in it that could be about what's happening today, wherever we look. So I did do this work, and I'm going to just read 4 poems from that collection. So the first one, he left for war on the 1st of September in 2014. He died on the 1st of September, 1914. He died on the 1st of September, 1918. September, and this is in the sisters' voice. They wrote letters very frequently to each other. September. The week before he left for France, we leaned a ladder into the apple trees, picked Cox's orange pippins, Newton wonders, Brownlee's russets, laid them one by one on dusty floorboards in the attic, then planted hyacinths and amaryllis for spring. We sat out after dinner and talked of how we loved this time of year, when hollyhocks are past their best, but still stand tall in copper, pink, and cream, beside clematis and the last of the sweet pea. One of the letters, the last letter that this young man sent to his sister Lucy, in it he thanks her for the sprig of heather in her last letter. And I suppose I just couldn't help thinking of her, writing her letter to him and picking a sprig of heather, putting it into the envelope and sending it off to the front. And then her getting this letter back from him, thanking her for it. And that was his last letter that she received. Ling. A sprig of heather falling from my sister's letter carries me north to the Cairngorms in August. A sea of honey-scented ling, purple flowers teeming with bees. A shepherd told us that at the time of creation, no plant would cover the bare mountain slopes. Only heather, out of kindness, offered its modest growth. A brave little plant, he called it. No matter how trampled by rutting stags, the woody branches spring back. And this young man was buried in Boucheven in France, northern France. And Paddy mentioned seeding potatoes, planting potatoes, but there was something about digging potatoes that helped me find a way of expressing what was going on with the numbers that were dying at that time. Boucheven. Some men sing, some men chat, all complain about the heat. We've been digging since early this morning, another 20 graves. While we bend and lift, wielding pickaxe, mattock, spade, I think of Grandpa's advice when digging potatoes. Wait till the vines have died down, he'd say. Be sure to dig gently, or you'll bruise the tubers that huddle like hen's eggs under the mound. Then let your shovel lift 7, 8, 9 into the light. And one last poem from this collection. This is in the sister's voice, and it's set at the time when she received her brother's kit after his death. Snow began to fall before dawn, blown horizontal in easterly winds from across the hill. By evening, it lies deep in banks and drifts. Hedges become whitewashed walls. Barrels turn into haystacks. The woodpile disappears. I could almost believe we haven't received your mud-caked kit. Breeches ripped from ankle to hip, bloodied tunic, your helmet slightly dinged, and the watch you won at school. I could almost believe you'll be with us for dinner, having walked in your trench boots all the way home through the snow. So, 3 poems now from my most recent collection, and then I'll go back to my first collection for a final poem. This most recent collection, in the time that I was writing it, I accompanied both my best friend and my father through illness to their deaths. So there's a very strong elegiac quality to the collection. There are different themes, but that runs right through the collection. So I want to read a poem from the last 2 months when we were nursing my father at home. I've got you. through days of morphine and titbits to tempt his appetite. There's nowhere else to be. I hold his teacup to his lips, wash his face and the hands I rarely touched. During the night, old hurts and worries surface like stones in a well-tilled field. What time is it now? He asks on the hour. He sings to himself and murmurs lines he learned as a child. All we like sheep have gone astray. We have turned every one to his own way. When he asks to get up, I hold his wrists, brace my weight against his. For a moment, he's confused. It's okay, Janie. I've got you. Go on now. You can stand. And another poem from that time, Cypress. Falling in and out of sleep all night, he suddenly struggles to sit up. Will you open the curtains so we'll see the dawn when it comes? He gazes out at the cypress that in his lifetime grew higher than the house, a tree that survived every winter's wind, its trunk ridged as a raised bed ready for seed, feathered foliage set to sprout flower balls, exposed roots worn bare as bones, branches touching the ground, forming a haven, a tree to sit in, quiet, waiting. And my father died at the age of 87, and he had farmed his farm, that farm that had come down through his family, since he was 14 or 15. He had never done anything else. He'd never been anywhere else. He never wanted to go anywhere else. And that was the life that he knew and loved. But when he died, there was an enormous wake over 2 days and anyway, the poem will speak about it, but this poem came from that. And I suppose I just wanted to say, I wanted in the poem in some way to acknowledge, that Ireland it's so modern in many ways, thankfully, and it has retained some wonderfully important traditions. And for me, the poem exemplifies one of those, respects. From Kiltoom, Creemully, Loughlin, Kilbegnet, Le Carrow, Athleague, Craigs, Carrowkeel, Ballinleg, they come to pay their respects. They shake hands with us, stand by his body and bow their heads. Cattlemen, sheepmen, carpenters, teachers, foresters, nurses, vets. They say prayers, lay their hands on his chest and bless themselves. Then fill the kitchen with the man they knew. A grand man altogether, always out early, hardy as a wild duck, a good judge of a bullock, a fierce man to work. He had woeful hands, a man of his word. I slip out for a while to see an orange globe over the common and a flock of whooper swans feasting on the last of the winter grass. So I'm coming to my last poem, just about the 30 minutes, Paddy. And Yeah, before I read it, I do want to say thank you very much for your attention. And we will have time for questions, but thank you so much for your attention. And it is wonderful to be here reading to all of you. And again, thanks to Paddy for that wonderful introduction. So for this one, I've chosen, it's a short little poem. It's in my first collection, and it was inspired by the wonderful African-American poet Lucille Clifton, one of my favourite poets, a magnificent poet. And I was driving down to Roscommon, driving across the country one day, and I was listening to her on a podcast. And some poem of hers got this poem going. I don't even remember what one it was, but this is what it got. I know it was her poem that got this one going. And I thought it was a good one to end tonight's reading with. Let there be. From breath to breath, from dusk to dusk, let there be rainfall when the soil is parched as rock. Let there be sunshine when the barley bends to be cut. Let there be rainbows when the days are short of light. Let there be wind when our boats are turned for home. Thank you very much. Thanks very much.
So one of the reasons we at Solas Nua love putting on events here in NYU, and Jane has alluded to already, there is always a generous attentiveness and engagement of the audience, no matter what the event is. And tonight is no exception, so I want to really thank you and thank Jane again. Thank you both. Also, Kevin tonight and Luke tonight, who are the two NYU staffers, exemplify the warmth of the reception. They have a unique combination of warmth and professionalism, and they get things done and they give us a warm welcome. So to Kevin and to Luke and to all the NYU staff, I also want to thank you. Thank you very much. So we'll take some questions. I will, I'm sure you've been at places where the moderator says, well, I'm going to ask a question or two and then I'm going to hand it over to the audience. And an hour later, the moderator is still asking the questions, right? So I'm not like that. So I'm going to start off with a question. There's two live mics on each side of the aisle. So if you have a question, would you mind going up to the mic and just speaking into it so we can honor your question by hearing it. So, and we'll go as long as there's energy for questions and energy with Jane for answering them. So I have the first question. Hello? Is it on? Yeah?
Yeah, that's good,
grand,
I think.
grand.
Yeah.
So Jane, my first question is, you had mentioned earlier that you didn't start writing poetry until you were maybe in your early 40s.
Yes.
So the question is, what was the stimulus for it at that age? And to anyone in the audience who kind of deep down has had this desire to write but hasn't done it and is, going on, like what would you say to them and what advice might you give them? But first of all, what was the catalyst for yourself?
Well, I always wanted to write. I had the dream, as a child. And I was always writing. Like my father used to call me Shevna the scribe out of Isaiah because I was always writing. But something about in my teens, I just lost all confidence in my own creativity. Something about the school system. I was, learning things and doing the right thing, but I wasn't coming out of my own self. And so then I trained as a psychotherapist and worked as a psychotherapist right through my 30s. And I think there's something about that work that freed up my creativity. And it kind of just helped me become more myself and find a truer voice. And then in my early 40s, I thought, well, I've wanted to do this forever. And so I did a night class in Bray, and that's what got it going. So, and I mean, one course I was doing, I was required to write 4 poems. And that was it, really. And I would not have chosen poetry, but I had to do it. And then it just took off from there.
And advice you might give?
Advice, well, I at class,
Go to a class. If you have that little dream or that desire, I would say follow it. But then after doing a class, I did join a writing group, and that was hugely important. For me, if I hadn't gone into a writing group, I wouldn't have kept going, because the help you get from your colleagues there, the encouragement you get, the affirmation you get, and the pleasure of sharing your writing with others and hearing their work is really important. So they'd be the big things: go on a course and then a writing group, and just let yourself give it a go. I mean, I do think there's a lot of experience of rejection along the way, but I think that's a bit easier to take when you're older, actually. I don't know if maybe that's part of why I didn't feel that confidence as a teenager. Maybe I wasn't able for that, able for the failure that's part of being creative. It just has to be there. So I think I would encourage people to let yourself make a mess, let yourself get it wrong, let yourself fail, and sort of just trust that you'll get better bit by bit by bit. It was 10 years before my first book came out. Some people were saying to me after 4 years, "Oh, you should be publishing." I'm really glad I waited and waited till it was a good standard to bring out into the world. Yeah.
Thank you, Jane. Yes. And thanks for being the brave first person. The first person is always the bravest.
Thank you for having a live mic, because I have a very soft voice as well. And I was going to actually ask exactly the question you started with, so I'm going to add to that now by saying, in your current writing life, and one hopes your extended future writing life, along the lines of what does a writing life look like? What are the things that help keep you going against the obstacles, things that shut you down, and then how you survive those obstacles? So the dynamic of keeping going in a writing life.
You obviously know some things about the writing life yourself. Things that keep me going. One thing is my workshop group. I have a group of 5. There's 5 of us. We meet once a month. I bring 2 poems a month, no matter what's happening. Like, say the next time I meet, it'll be pretty hard to have my 2 poems because of, all of this going on, but I'll have my 2 poems. So that's one thing, to keep your process going, keep your writing, no matter what's happening. The other thing is I have a poetry reading group as well. So I have 2 separate groups, and it meets once every 6 weeks, where we choose 1 poem to study in depth every 6 weeks. So that's another really important, a kind of a discipline and a way, because of course it's reading other poets that's very important. What else? I mean, things like, doing readings are encouraging. It really is encouraging to know that your work matters. And then sending poems out for publication. In the earlier years, I sent out to a lot of competitions, and when you just get, even if you got placed or even if you got longlisted, at that time, that was the kind of encouragement I needed. So I think all of those things really help. And then I suppose I think there was a point where I said to myself, this matters. My writing matters. And it's some permission you have to give to yourself to make the time for it. Because, I saw myself, I was an activist, a community worker, involved, outward bound a lot. And to be able to say, your writing is as important as that. That was a hard one for me, because I wanted to change the world, and I still want the world to be a better place. But to see, Paula Meehan, that wonderful Irish poet, talks about trusting that art is also a force for social change. And that can be a hard thing to trust yourself. But anyway, it's a permission you have to give yourself, I think. Yeah.
Thank you very much for the question.
Thanks for a great presentation. And just kind of building on your response, wondering if you could talk about poets who have influenced you. In particular, I was wondering about Robert Frost with some of your nature poems.
Absolutely. I adore Robert Frost. And I would have I read Robert Frost back when I was a student, but since I started writing, I read a lot of Robert Frost, studied him for quite a period of about 3 months or so, and would go back to him again and again. It's interesting. Mending Wall was one of the first poems. I remember bringing it down to discuss it with my father, and my father wasn't an academic, but he left school at 14, but. Robert Frost you don't have to be an academic, even though he is a very complex poet, but lots of people can come to Robert Frost and find something there. But obviously Seamus Heaney, Patrick Kavanagh, but also, as I say, people like Lucille Clifton, and then people like Gillian Clarke, who's a Welsh poet that I really love. I love Auden. I love Milosz, the Polish poet. Absolutely love his work. I could go on forever. Jane Hirschfield, wonderful poet. I read quite a few. I read a lot of North American poetry and love a lot of North American poetry, actually, both the more in the past, but also the contemporary poets as well.
Thank you.
So yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Martin. Yes, sir.
Are you Pat or Patty?
Patty.
Okay, all right.
Patrick.
I just wanted
No,
to
no.
get
If
it
it was
right.
Patrick, I was in trouble. So Patty.
Okay, all right, Patty. Well, you were spot on when you were talking about accessibility. And that's something that I really, really admire about your work. I don't know what a sheet is, but I can still grasp the humanity of your poetry, regardless of, it being in Ireland.
Yeah.
I guess I wanted to ask a couple of things. One is, you mentioned being an activist.
Yeah.
Do you have to work hard at figuring out what camp you're going to be writing in? Some of your poetry, I guess your first book, is definitely your upbringing and your home and your love and all of that. And then I guess the latter book was something about the World War II person. But being active and what's going on today, do you struggle with trying to figure out what camp to write in?
Thank you.
Well, I suppose I think your question is a bit about political poetry as regards the more personal. Would that be right? Is that part of what you're saying?
Yeah, basically.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think it's hard to write a really good political poem. I think it's easy to write a polemical poem, but to really get the subtlety that's needed in any poem, doesn't matter what kind of a poem it is. And I suppose for me, it's the ones where there's something. For me, it always comes from an emotional response, the depth of an emotional response. That's what gets the poem going for me. So I can't really decide I'm going to write that. You know what I mean? It's not an intellectual decision, because it's something about the emotional impulse that gets the rhythm and the line going for me.
Okay.
So for example, one of the things I'm interested in doing work is, Frederick Douglass did this trip to Ireland, and I would love to, do some work.
Scottish.
Yeah, I'd love to do some work about that. I don't know if I'll be able to. You see what I mean? It isn't something that you can say, oh yeah, I'll write that definitely. What I'll do is I'll immerse myself in his writing. I think his autobiography is wonderful writing. I'll immerse myself, and in a year's time, let's see what I've done. But it's not a 2 + 2 = 4 process at all,
Right.
So you just kind of hope, immerse yourself and hope that something good will come.
And I would like to ask another question, if I could. Do you work, when we were talking about accessibility, the imagery that you create with your poems is just fantastic. Do you work really hard to capture the essence in the imagery in that sort of way?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for that. I wouldn't say, I don't think you can work hard at the imagery. It's actually funny. It's not you can't work hard. You have to let it come, you have to kind of go for a walk, you have to be aware, you have to be open, you have to be listening, you have to keep yourself, you have to be reading. You know, the images then come to you. I mean, the work hard is the bit where you're crafting and, you know, trying to get the lines right and all that. I'd say that's more the sculpting of it.
Right.
But I think the images, like, work hard wouldn't be the right thing. It's something about, again, immersing yourself and letting them come to you.
Okay.
You know,
Fair
but yeah,
enough.
it's great questions. Thank
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks,
Do you
John.
have another question? Thank you.
Hello.
Hi.
I was very interested in the way you mentioned how the poems from your different collections have begun to speak to each other in ways
Yeah.
that were a little surprising. I really enjoyed the set of poems about the unspoken feminist urges in the women's
Yes.
voices.
Yeah.
And that's related a little bit to what you just said about 2 + 2 not quite equaling 4. And I'm always really curious about how collections are constructed by different poets. And, you know,
Yeah.
for me, it always works to spread them all out on the floor and
Yes.
look at them all at the same
Yes.
time and begin to see those connections. But I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how each of the collections, I mean, the one based on the letters is going to be somewhat different because I'm assuming
Yes.
that that's chronological. But
Yes.
I don't think this book is exactly chronological. So
Yeah.
how did you structure the collection overall?
Yeah, no, it's a very interesting question. One thing is, it was much easier to structure this collection than my first one. Really, and that was very interesting for me. And my first one, I sort of, I gave it out to my workshop group and said, well, what do you think? And what do you think? And I wanted views from other people. And this time I just knew much more myself. And so what I tried to do with this one is to start with the father, and because his illness started, about 10 years ago, and to start with poems of anxiety about the loss of the father in the beginning, and then to move away from that into some general farming poems, then to looking at women, looking at gay lives in Ireland, then looking at the mother, and then from the mother moving back to those final 2 months. So the final 2 months are the last, I think, maybe third or maybe quarter of the collection, quarter probably only. So that seemed the right chronology for me, that in the beginning there was that anxiety, that sense of, someone aging and becoming more frail, and that how big that is for us when it's our parent. But then other things happening in between, other living going on, and then coming back to that, which was, I suppose, such a fundamental time for me, and which gave me so much work. I didn't expect that it would, but being able to write about my father in that way and his illness was hugely important for me, and was a richness for me. Yeah.
So when I delve deeper into this, I'm going to be able to appreciate what I think we call a narrative arc. Do you think a collection of poetry needs a narrative arc?
I don't think it needs it, but I can, and when I was doing my first one, I kind of resisted that, and I sort of hated that it had, now it usedn't to be such a thing. It's a real fashion now, So I kind of resisted it, but I can see how, I think the thing of having poems beside each other that speak to each other, that resonate with each other, I do think that really works. And so I do think that can strengthen the collection. But I would say my first collection, even though there is a kind of a narrative arc in that it starts from earlier on in my life, goes to the growing up, and then goes towards, But more of those would stand out just as poems on their own, I think. I think in this one there are a number of sequences. And just to say, that was a developmental step for me. I remember doing a workshop with Mimi Calvati, this English Persian poet, who's a wonderful poet. And it was all about sequences. I remember thinking, I wouldn't know how to write a sequence. So that's interesting. That was 5 years ago. I had only written kind of individual poems, but these are all sequences now. So that's, for me, that's good because, if you think of the sides on a jewel, there's all these different sides. And any experience we have, there's all these, it's never just one experience. So a sequence allows you address the different aspects. So that's what I love about them.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. Another question? Going, gone. So if you want to see a real moderator in action, come along tomorrow night where Ron Charles from the Washington Post will be having a conversation with Jane at the Friends Meeting House in Florida Avenue at 7 o'clock. Just to finish on a couple of things, Sebastian Barry, the great Irish writer, was interviewed about 9 months ago, and he said that when people look back in 20 or 30 years, what we're going through now will be seen as a golden age of Irish writing. And I believe it will actually be seen as a golden age of Irish arts because there's this explosion of creativity, not just in literature, but in filmmaking and animation, in the visual arts, and in fashion design, in architecture. And there's things that make it different. Like up to about 1960, it's swear that Irish women couldn't write. They didn't suddenly get smart like 10 years ago. They were smart all along. They just never got published, never got distributed, never got access. Gay people, what we call travelers, or the traveling community. So there's a whole new range of voices now through all the different disciplines of the arts, exploring and engaging with issues that were never engaged with before. So there's this newness and this kind of excitement, and there's this energy in Irish arts. And Jane is an example of that, in the sense that I would say 20, 30 years ago, you probably wouldn't have been published. And you certainly wouldn't have been here in NYU, reading poetry to folks like yourself. So it's really healthy and exciting, and it's not to be taken for granted, because for too long, many of those voices were silent. Solas Nua, our job then in Solas Nua is that the voices that haven't really been heard loud yet in America, like Jane's, are given a platform here, given a stage here, and that so that people can, as we said before, discover new work and new poems and become interested in and have a conversation with the poem and the poet. In November and December, we have a major visual arts exhibition partnering with AU, with the Katzen Centre, with two of the finest visual artists in Ireland today who are doing stuff that's never been done. And we have a play going on in the Roundhouse Theatre in November and December. In January, called The Smuggler, which is a tour de force. And we are, as Solas Nua, we're all volunteer. So for us, the pride and the joy is a night like tonight with Jane, her poetry, the conversation, yourselves. So thanks again for coming. Have a few glasses of wine, or at least one anyway, but have a couple if you have to. But buy at least one book or a couple. Do it the other way around. One glass of wine, a couple of books, and Jane will sign them above. And again, thanks a million, and thank you to NYU. Good night.